Welcome to everyone on this October Friday morning. My name is Rick Beaudry. I am one of the founders of ThoughtRock. Thanks for including us in the start of your Friday. With the help of two hosts, John Towsley and Jim Jackson, we're going to learn why DevOps works, how it relates and works with ITIL, and the benefits getting you and your team trained and certified. So in this session, as you've seen probably in the emails, invitations, and the registration that you were sent, a little brief history of DevOps and its benefits, the connection between DevOps and ITIL, the benefits of training and certification for individuals and organizations, and hopefully some discussion and some questions that you can post in the chat feature. So a little bit about our presenters and we'll get started. So John Towsley is co-founder of ThoughtRock, excuse me, and a serial entrepreneur, having co-founded and sold two other technology service companies. John is a graduate of Richard Ivey School of Business at the University of Western Ontario, and he's got over 30 plus years in building, coaching, consulting, and certifying professionals in the IT infrastructure and best practices space. Jim Jackson, our other presenter, is the founder and managing director at Blue Sky AFC Associates. He's a graduate of Bishop's University, and Jim has over 38 years experience. Man, I got some grandfathers with me here. 38 years experience with IT. He holds the ITIL Expert Certification, ITIL 4 certification, and now the DevOps certification. He's been instrumental in the design and support of our ThoughtRock certification bundles and continues to support our clients and our staff in ITIL and now DevOps. And the last thing I'll say before we turn it over to Jim is please feel free to post your questions in the chat feature, and we will do our best to address all those at the end of the session. We just want to keep the session flowing for people that need to get through it and maybe have to leave, but we'll definitely hang in there for all the chat questions as much as we can. Our schedule is to end the session at 10 a.m. Probably end a little bit earlier than that, but we will that will depend on the questions that are asked. So with that, I will turn it over to Jim Jackson.
Thank you, Rick. The slide asks a question: why do we need high velocity business? And we want to talk about high velocity business. It's a term that's getting a lot of airtime right now and has been for quite a while, actually. And it's the subject of multiple publications, both in the pure business genre as well as in the IT service management topic areas. If you were to just do a Google search for books about high velocity business, you're going to get a lengthy return list from Google or whatever your favorite search engine is. The interesting thing about the list, though, is what you're going to find is that there's publications discussing high velocity business really from every business sector. So whether you're interested in finance, insurance, scientific research, big pharma, manufacturing, sales management, this is a topic of discussion and publications literally everywhere today. When we look specifically at IT service management discussions, if you take a look at ITIL version 4, the latest releases of ITIL, there is actually an ITIL 4 specialist designation called High Velocity IT. And we will talk a little bit about why we need high velocity IT, but it's all about supporting high velocity business. If we look at the DevOps areas, if you've started looking at any DevOps events or maybe even have attended anything, you're going to run across a very, he does a lot of speaking at DevOps events. He has publications, but a gentleman named Dr. Stephen Spear, and he wrote a book called The High Velocity Edge. And his book is a study of high velocity businesses and the characteristics that they have that put them into leadership positions in the industries that they're in. So this concept of the high velocity business, it's even further supported here when we look at this statement from Klaus Schwab. He's the founder and the executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, and he made a statement that says, in the new world, it's not the big fish which eats the small fish, it's the fast fish that eats the slow fish. And I would speculate that most, if not all of us, have heard and or witnessed stories of disruption, either in our own marketplaces or in just general industry that we watch. You know, how some small startup launches something that changes or disrupts an existing business model or a paradigm, and they win and they end up being a leader. Now, that first step is actually based on innovation for how they get their first win. But when we talk about high velocity, that's what they're going to require to maintain a leadership position. And if somebody has disrupted a market where maybe your organization had a leadership position, you're going to need high velocity business operations to now be able to compete with that disruptor. You could just think about the taxi versus rideshare business and how Uber disrupted the business and they won. And they've continued to operate at high velocity and remain a leader in that market segment. Now, some taxi operators got eaten. Some tried to adapt. Others tried to get government bodies involved with legislation. And then even other new rideshare organizations came into the marketplace, such as Lyft. All kinds of things happened. But through it all, the leaders continue to operate at high velocity. So some people may have believed that Uber's success was purely technology-based. And so we saw some of the taxi organizations and adapters, they were licensing technology and taking it to various taxi organizations. It worked for some, but not for others. And all of that showed us was it's not just the technology. It's not as simple as having a great app and that you're going to win. And so when we talk about high velocity IT, we define it as IT service delivery for significant business enablement, where time to market, time to customer, and time to change are crucial for the success of the business. So start to think of that as a statement of objectives versus what your current IT service delivery organization looks like. So everything related to high velocity IT talks about time to customer and time to change. Well, when I think of high velocity IT, I think of DevOps. And again, at DevOps conferences and events and in publications, a very pervasive theme is better value, sooner, safer, happier. Matter of fact, that's actually a title of a book that's being released by the person that coined that phrase. But it really summarizes what DevOps methodologies are trying to do. So what is DevOps? Well, you can see the definition that it's a combination of ITIL, lean, and agile methodologies into a development and operations approach. It utilizes best practices from those three disciplines. It utilizes automation to support workflow throughout the value stream and automation in the continuous delivery pipeline. And it really relies on a culture of collaboration and learning throughout the service value system. Now you also see the diagram that is called the stack diagram, indicating here that there are key success factors from automation, the development and implementation of practices in an organization, and the underlying culture and people resources in organization. These three areas are all important for successful DevOps implementations. Well, what's so different about DevOps? And I mean, if we did a comparison with a traditional IT approach, and we can look at these various dimensions that are indicated on this slide, you might describe traditional IT as, in the planning and organizational dimensions, as big. So typically a lot of waterfall development methodology, skill-centric silos where people are broken into departments based on skill sets, and a centralized scheduling, planning, and decision-making approach, which oftentimes comes from the bureaucratic type of organizational structure that a traditional IT environment may have or have come from. Contrast that with a DevOps approach where your batch size is micro or very small. So you're doing small batches. Your organization, you're creating dedicated cells or cross-functional teams as opposed to the siloed organization. It's all about breaking down those silos and decentralized and continuous scheduling and decision-making. Decision-making can be made at that team level oftentimes very well suited to product-oriented operations. In the performance and culture areas, traditional IT releases are seen as high-risk events because maybe you're doing 4 releases a year, like 1 a quarter, or maybe it's 2 releases a year. And these releases are so important because they're so big and all-encompassing. So they're high-risk events. Information is disseminated. It tends to be pushed out. And the culture is do not fail or you will be blamed. Contrast that with DevOps, you're releasing all the time. So they're a regular occurrence. They're almost non-events because they're happening all the time. Information needs to be actionable. People want to pull information when they need it, not have it pushed at them when they don't need it. And the culture is really one of learning, so it's no-fault failures. Failures are seen as learning opportunities, and so it's not a culture of blame. In the areas of measurement, traditional IT is seen as cost and capacity, and that can be very isolated in terms of the cost and capacity that I'm responsible for. I've met my objectives. And the definition of done is very much, I did my job. Contrasting that again with the DevOps approach, it's all about cost, capacity, and flow, and it's an end-to-end view. And it's not about I did my job, but it's about our team successfully got the next feature, update, whatever it is, ready to deploy. So that's how the two compare and contrast. So DevOps is very much end-to-end. It's a systems thinking approach, and it works well with product-oriented structures. It focuses on flow within the value stream. So oftentimes a DevOps approach objective is to be end-to-end. And again, another mantra or saying or result of DevOps operations is you build it, you run it. So you don't just build something and throw it over the wall to operations. You now have a cross-functional team with end-to-end responsibility. So today's organizations need greater flexibility to create new products and services. And it can mean survival for some businesses in the face of competitors who may have abilities to design and develop new products within weeks instead of months or years. The speed of time to market is vital as part of the business and digital transformations. You see the various columns here on the slide. The final bullet point at the bottom of each column indicates a speed of change in the organization. And so we're looking at how organizations are evolving to become high velocity businesses and how the various stages of evolution have continued to work to try and speed up that ability to change at the speed that the business requires. So DevOps is very much a combination of lean and agile software development approaches with ITIL. And DevOps continues to grow and gain momentum. And we've also recently, within the last year, seen ITIL evolve to version 4. And the ITIL evolution was really to better embrace lean, agile, and DevOps methodologies and to truly support high velocity IT.
Great, thanks, Jim. Actually, before I go on, I'm going to pass it back to Rick. Rick's going to set the stage a little bit here.
One of the things before John speaks is just for everyone on the line, depending on what your background knowledge is so far in the evolution of DevOps and where it's at. And some people are ITIL certified and thinking about DevOps maybe. Some are just thinking about it in terms of organizational change. But I think a few key things that were important stats and have also kind of reiterated why ThoughtRock got into the DevOps certification to augment our ITIL certification was a few things that we found that are important in the job market as well as in industry. One thing is if you do a hashtag on lookup on LinkedIn, you'll see these comparisons, which which I think are enormous. You know, with the certifications in ITIL, with Lean, Agile, Prince2, PMI, and you take a look at the followers to those hashtags, and then you look at the newcomer to the field, but where the followers are in terms of numbers, it's fairly staggering. So it tells you, that there is some significant movement growth in people pursuing and looking at both DevOps from an organizational change, as well as from certification and training. And specifically for those looking in terms of certification for their own skill set, Indeed, on September 29th, we did a quick lookup of job postings that ask specifically for DevOps or ITIL or Agile. And with both ITIL and Agile being around longer, and you look at the growth in DevOps in terms of actual job openings, and I believe that was in the United States, 2,034 jobs on that day that were posted looking for that skill set. So I think one of the things we recognize is that this is going to be a significantly fast-growing area, and it's one of the reasons why we added it to our bundle of certification at ThoughtRock. Thanks, John.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rick. So Jim did a good job of outlining what DevOps is and why it's important to businesses. I want to reiterate a bit of that. You know, the drivers to organizations for deploying DevOps and DevOps tools are these things bulleted here. You know, to enhance their productivity, streamline their workflows, reduce that time to market that Jim talked about, and along with that, deliver better quality software. The other thing that happens when you do all those things is you minimize the costs associated with software development, delivery, and maintenance. And as Jim talked about, you know, that's important because more and more across lots of industries, the competitive nature of business is such that your business line, even if you're not a technology company, is tied to your ability to deploy the technology that supports and enhances your business and services your customers. So one of the biggest challenges, you know, and it has been for quite a while, is a lack of a skilled workforce. And, you know, Jim talked about the stack in terms of automation and process and culture, and the certification that we're looking at in DevOps, the DevOps Fundamental, really talks about the bottom two pillars of that stack and addressing the lack of a skilled workforce. So just to put this in context a little bit, you know, Rick talked about jobs and so on. The global DevOps market was valued at $3.62 billion US in 2018, and it's expected to reach 20 billion by 2026. So that's a 24.7 compounded annual growth rate. And those numbers talk about the whole market, if you think about that whole stack. So, you know, a lot of the jobs that you'll see advertised talk about specific technologies and technical skills related to deploying those technologies. But this encompasses that whole marketplace, and it's quite interesting. So just to put some more quantitative factors to what we're talking about, companies that deploy DevOps can and typically do implement code 208 times more frequently based on the survey, and 106 times faster from lead time to commit to deploy. So, you know, if you buy into the fact that deploying technology, developing new technologies, customer facing or not customer facing, is critical to your business, getting it done 106 times faster is a pretty key thing. The other thing that's interesting are the bottom two items. You know, the time to recover from incidents is 2,600 times faster. So we all, you know, those of us who have ITIL backgrounds understand incident management and talk about downtime and resilience in our environments. That's a pretty big number, and it's key to being able to continue to service not only your employees but your customers. You know, Rick and I spent a long time back in our heyday of ITIL consulting and you know, traveling around North America and a little bit of Europe, talking about change and the havoc that's wreaked in organizations by change failures. So 7 times lower change failures is a pretty key thing. The other thing I'd point out on this slide is, you know, Jim talked about the integration of DevOps and ITIL. You know, initially in the market, there's some confusion. Well, is ITIL dead? Does DevOps replace it? And in fact, not. If you think about the 2 green boxes at the top of the screen, those are things that are coming from the DevOps philosophy and DevOps adoption. And
Hey, John, just a quick question for you. I'm not sure if you can hear it.
Sure.
There's a significant clicking going on. I don't know if it's something, if maybe Sue, if you can make sure everybody else is muted. Um, I'm not sure what that is, but
Oh, great.
just keep
Is
talking.
it a steady clicking or?
Yeah. Well, just anyway, just make sure. I
Okay.
don't know if there's anything moving there. Just wanted to let you know because I know everyone else on the line was probably hearing the same thing.
Okay. I'll make sure it's not me. I
I
don't
think
think
it's
so.
something on your computer or your headset that's moving.
Yeah, that's probably what it is. I tend to wave my hands around when I talk. So.
Yeah, so maybe just keep your headsets. Sorry to intervene, everyone, but still doing it right now. So I don't know if you can just keep your microphone just completely steady.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Is that better now? Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll see what happens here. So, if you look at the top two boxes, those things are related to DevOps, and the bottom two boxes are really things that are related to ITIL. And so what you see is the integration of those things. So let's just look at the market a little bit. We've got people on the call from all around the world, and that is really reflective of the way DevOps is being adopted. North America a little bit ahead of Europe and APAC, but it is definitely a global phenomenon. And not surprisingly, when you look at organizations, there are a couple things interesting on this slide. Larger organizations tend to be a bit ahead of the curve, and I suspect that's because they have the most to gain. They have large organizations. They are developing their own applications. They have development shops, and they're pretty savvy about how they need to compete in the new world and how quickly they need to get things to market. I suspect that the 100 to 499 band, which probably lines up with sort of the $1 billion to $10 billion revenue range, is the disruptors most likely in the economy. Those are tech companies, startups, that kind of thing. If you look at the industries where DevOps is being adopted most quickly, not surprisingly, technology companies are ahead of the curve, but then quickly followed by industries where technology is a key component of the service provided. So at financial services, if you think about your bank and insurance company and so on, I see now updates to my bank apps, I would say probably weekly. One of my good friends actually is a project manager at an insurance/bank company in North America, and managing the release of the updates to their app. And really, when I first started talking about DevOps, he said, "Oh, it's all about DevOps for sure." So, I think that's what you see. It's across all industries and dominant in the industries where you would expect to see that. So the question for us as a service provider to the industry, when we really got looking at the market and DevOps and what was happening is, is there a fundamental need for a certification? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But once we established that we thought a certification was a good thing for the marketplace, the question was, where do you go? We landed on PeopleCert. Obviously, we have a relationship with PeopleCert because we are an ITIL training organization. DevOps is a cultural movement. So unlike ITIL, there isn't anyone who owns the intellectual property. So if you're familiar with ITIL, you know that it sort of came out of the UK government and then morphed from there. But the ITIL set of documentation books originally is copyrighted, and that copyright is fairly tightly protected. Not so much the case, obviously, in DevOps. So it's a practice that's continually evolving, and there is no one universal body of knowledge. So the result of that is that there are different certifications in the market. And we chose to work with PeopleCert for a number of reasons, but one of the key reasons is that they're well-established, growing, well-run organization, and did a lot of research to develop a well-thought-out and valuable certification. have entered the market with two certifications, the DevOps Fundamentals, and that's what ThoughtRock has launched initially. And we may follow that up with the leadership. As we've talked about, this certification really talks to the bottom two pillars of the critical successes to DevOps. So not about the technologies and how do you deploy any particular vendor's technology for releasing, developing and releasing software, but really about the culture and the best practices. So I'm going to turn this back over to Jim on the next slide to talk about what's included in this certification and those 15 practices.
Yeah, thanks, John. So the DevOps Fundamentals course, it's a pretty wide-ranging course, and you can see the various bullets of what's covered off in here. The key thing that gets communicated, obviously gives you some history and talks about the need and the business value for DevOps. There are certain areas and very standard terms in DevOps, no matter whose certification you're going to do. So you will always hear talk of the three ways: continuous delivery, and DevOps culture, and structures for teaming, and then various practices. What I liked about the People Cert course was that they identified these 15 practices. Now, the team that actually wrote the content for the course are all practitioners in IT service management from various fields with tons and tons of experience. And they identified from their own experiences that there were 15 key practice areas that were really important. This is one of the differentiators for this course, and what I like about it is that it's practical information. And when you actually look at these practices, you can see that some of them are directly from Lean, some of them are directly from Agile, and almost half of them are directly from ITIL. And the ITIL ones have been updated to ITIL version 4 practice descriptions. So this is one of the real values of this course, is that it talks about these practices. It doesn't go into great depth, and obviously the exam is going to ask some questions about identifying these practices, but it gives you a good start on understanding the types of things that DevOps implementations and DevOps teams need to be working with and working towards.
So I've been in the certification for a business for a long time. As Rick talked about, he actually literally does have a grandfather on the call. And, one of the best quotes I ever heard about certifications and the value of certifications was really, a certification is valuable if it's a reliable predictor of performance. So the question then that raises, is as an organization or as with consultants on the call, I'm sure, or individual practitioners, if you certify a single employee in DevOps, will they perform better? And I think the answer is they might, but remember that culture is one of the pillars, the three pillars that we're talking about here. And any individual, doesn't constitute a culture. So while that employee's performance may slightly improve, it's not likely to improve greatly because there are some limitations. So then you ask yourself, well, if we certify our whole team, will we all perform better? And the answer to that is maybe. So, we've seen this in ITIL in the early days, and we tailored our recommendations and services to customers in the ITIL space, because what we saw initially was organizations would go out and certify everybody in the organization in ITIL, and then expect things to improve, and they didn't. So we'll talk in a minute about the approach. So you don't necessarily need to certify your whole team. That'd be great for us, but frankly, we don't always recommend it. Then, the last couple things here, the age-old question is what if we train people and they leave? Next bullet, Sue. And that's the answer to that question. what if we don't and they stay? So let's talk a little bit about the corporate culture and training your team, what works and what doesn't work. So as I said, I think we have people from corporations on the call, and we also have individual practitioners. There are a few options here. I want to talk a little bit about training versus learning and go back to that conversation point about, if we certify everybody, will we automatically gain the benefits? The old adage in the HR space is, if you think about training versus learning, you think about, sex education, which one you want for your kids. Here we're really talking in our DevOps certification at the foundations level, we're really talking about learning. So what this certification is aimed to do is to get people thinking about the processes and the cultures that are going to enable DevOps to work. Because you can implement all the technology you want and have all the certified and skilled people in technologies that you want, and still fall flat on your face. The other thing that we find that works is understanding formal versus informal learning. So, what we've launched some formal learning around DevOps, what it is, what it means, how to be successful. The informal learning is almost just as important. So if you go back to my previous thoughts about certifying individuals or certifying a whole team, it's kind of a path that we recommend you go through. So you start by certifying some key people, and those key people become evangelists, and they then enable the informal learning. So I often talk about, my journey as a skier. I love to ski. When I was quite young, I took ski lessons, and, I learned the techniques and I practiced the techniques, and I was okay. And then I remember very clearly one day going down a fairly steep slope and falling down, and my dad was skiing beside me, and he looked at me, he said, son, if you fall down every time you get in trouble, you're never going to be a good skier. And that's the informal learning, and it made a big difference. And those aren't the kind of things that you get in formal lessons. It comes more from coaching while you're practicing. And so certifying those key employees can help create evangelists and mentors and facilitate that informal learning. In large organizations, we saw a lot of DevOps deployment happens in large organizations. There's an HR training and development team. You need to understand, how they work, what their processes, what their budgets are, and how this ties back to individual career paths and planning. So typically, most organizations have set out budgets for training for individuals. Individuals have goals and objectives that they're driving towards each year. Integrating what you're trying to do in DevOps with that HR training and development team, you can really leverage them to help you succeed. They also have expertise in something called competencies, which I won't get into now. But for DevOps to succeed in an organization, you need a fairly large number of individuals with competencies and skills related to DevOps. And your HR and training and development team can help you understand that and help you understand how it works into the HR system and the motivations and compensation and all those wonderful things. The last bullet on this slide is about cost justification strategies. So we put up some numbers that are pretty compelling. This is a long game. So you're not going to go train 5 people and see an instant payback. But the cost justification is pretty simple when you look at, 2,000 times faster incident resolutions, or, any of those other stats that we talked about earlier. So just to wrap this up, what do we recommend that you do? Well, start with some awareness. So get a few key people. If you're an independent consultant yourself, get up to speed. Read some of the literature that's out there. There's some great books. Start with that awareness. Obviously, we're recommending that take a certification for all the reasons we talked about. Leverage e-learning. That's why we offer this course as self-study. Coincidentally, right now, that's obviously a good thing and an enabler in today's environment. certify those key people. And then, as I said earlier, work with your HR training and development departments to incentive them and motivate them, so that you have more of a chance of being successful with the DevOps implementation. And focus on a targeted knowledge transfer to change behaviors. This is about a cultural change. And so you need to move everybody along with you as you go, taking those key people, having them be evangelists, certifying more, training more people, changing and implementing the processes, the way you do things, and then adopting the technologies, obviously, to support that. So I'll turn it back to you, Rick and Sue. I think that wraps up the formal part of the presentation.
Excellent, John. Thanks, John and Jim. Great insight. And as John mentioned, I think every organization, well, again, we have people on the phone who are management personnel trying to understand DevOps, maybe for the first time, or also understanding, as John mentioned, where do we focus on the training strategy by person, by group, by individual, what's needed. Definitely any kind of follow-up to ask us those questions can be posted on our Thought Rock website, and someone will follow up and help you answer those questions. We see people do everything from, with our self-study and e-learning, produce kind of a foundational level knowledge through e-learning and self-study, so everybody in the organization, or at least the key people, understand. And then John says you start deciding who needs to take further paths towards certification at a higher level. And so we see different approaches across the board. So, but we're more than willing to chat with you. We have excellent options for organizations who want to do training and be able to manage the learning management piece of it on their own, either their own LMS or through some LMS tracking. Got some great ways to do that for large groups of people, as well as it's fairly easy to be set up on the individual certification path as well. So I see a question just been posted here, so we'll jump to it. What is the learning curve of DevOps, and what about career development? So Jim or John, could you jump in on that question? Again, it's what is the learning curve of DevOps, and what about career development?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take the first part, then Jim, you may want to talk a bit more about the learning curve. So from a DevOps foundations and leadership perspective, which are the two courses that we're looking at from PeopleCert, the learning curve is not too steep. So conceptually, it's fairly easy to understand what it's about, especially if you're an IT practitioner, and even more so if you've got ITIL training and experience. It's a pretty flat curve to understand it at the conceptual level. That learning curve gets a little steeper when you get to the implementation. Jim can probably talk to that about that stack. When you talk about automation, there are specific certifications for specific vendor technologies. So much like we've seen traditionally in the IT space, where it's easy to understand what servers are and what the ITIL model is for IT service, but you need some people who are trained in security. You need people who are trained in the change management technologies. You need people who are specialists in the incident management technologies, or now you see software that like ServiceNow that goes across all of those processes. So you need people who are experts in there, and that's a little bit steeper learning curve at that level of the stack. From a career development perspective, a great question. I think harkening back to Rick's stats, what we're seeing is more and more job postings where the job description is calling for specific DevOps skills and DevOps experience. So, if you look at that, if that survey is anywhere close to right, and the market stats, a market growing at 26% a year in terms of its economic impact, the career opportunities are huge. And that's why we talked a little bit about integrating that with the HR department to make sure that they know what those competencies and skills are about, and everybody's working together to give people career paths. Jim, I don't know if you want to talk about the learning curve anymore.
I think you described it pretty well John, it's not about specific tools. It's about loosely coupled tools that are providing the value that you need to do the things that you need to do. Over and above that, the key practices. So if you've been an ITIL practitioner, you may not be familiar with some of the more agile type of practices, in particular Scrum and things of that nature. And Scrum is typically one of the approaches that's used with DevOps teams. So there might be a little additional learning there. The fundamentals course is going to touch on it. It's going to touch on the basics of it. It's going to refer to other things. You can pick up a lot of the other knowledge with additional readings, and or you could, if Scrum is going to be super important, you could start to look at agile type of certifications and or training in Scrum and those types of team operation. But that would be the main thing.
John, if you could, well, you and I both keep our mics on here, and Jim, if you want to pipe in as well, because I think this next question is a great question for, both John and I have built and run a number of companies and sold 2 companies, one with a significant 24/7 operation that, had to have uptime to the nth degree. I mean, we couldn't afford to be down. It was, critical exam monitoring business. So, the question, I think, is a cultural question, which is that very, bottom of the stack, Jim. And this person's basically saying, as an IT operations team specialist in the government, we're finding it challenging bringing stakeholders on board with DevOps. We have set up an Azure DevOps environment, have benefited from the Scrum, Kanban board models, pipelines, et cetera, but it's still a challenge, it sounds like, to bring stakeholders on board with DevOps. So, John, what if you were kind of talking through and a little bit of coaching on that topic of, because it sounds like it's around culture and change, but what would you say to someone who's having that challenge in terms of bringing their organization on board with just the concept and DevOps itself, right?
Yeah, it's a great comment / question, and thanks, Adriana. I think the first parallel I would draw back to is ITIL. So we, 10 or 15 years ago, we saw ITIL really start to take off, especially in North America, because it was driven by a fundamental business need. So what happened is the business managers, presidents, and vice presidents were going to the CIOs and IT vice presidents and saying, hey, your operation's busted. I'm tired of my people screaming at me because they can't get the helpless desk to answer their questions. And I'm tired of our systems going down because you guys are making changes and they're not working. And so typically the CIO would charge, it might be the help desk manager with figuring it out, say, go find out how somebody else does this. How do you do this? What's the best practice in the industry? And it would take them to ITIL. And as I talked about, what we saw then was this huge wave of people saying, well, let's train everybody in ITIL. And then, that'll fix our problem. So it is a journey, and it's a great question. So here's what we see, and here's what we would recommend. So first of all, if you have a few key people and, you've got Azure set up and you're starting to work on the Kanban boards and models and managing those pipelines, that's all really great. And you're probably seeing some benefits coming from that. So as you see those benefits, it's important to document them and then evangelize them through the organization. And this is where we jumped into the market, because we see this evolving, and it's where we've been very successful with ITIL Foundations. We went with the online model and our bundle model because we wanted to help the industry evangelize. We said, you know what, if we can get the training out there for the cost of the certification, then we can do some really great things in the market, because organizations can afford to train more people. What fundamental foundations training does is get everybody speaking the same language. And maybe it's a bad analogy, but in the vernacular term, you get everybody starting to drink the Kool-Aid. And it raises that level of awareness, and then it gives you a vehicle to start promoting some of the early wins that you've had through the things that you've done. And that gets executive attention because you need executive sponsorship for cultural changes. So if the executives in your organization, not in IT, but outside IT, see the benefits, they'll support this. And then foundation level training can really give you that bit of a boost. So yeah, governments are resistant to change, although, as it grew, we saw a tremendous amount of ITIL support and deployment in the government organizations that we work with. So I think, that can definitely work. The other thing, which may be a little odd to say, but somebody we worked back in the ITIL days was a gentleman named Gene Kim, and he's a key figure now in the DevOps space. Back in those days, when we were talking to him about ITIL, it was really about managing change and talking about securing the environment, and as Rick loves to talk about, electrifying the fence around assets and so on. Gene wrote a book called The Phoenix Project, and it's a novel actually, but I will guarantee you, if you circulated a few copies of those around with resistant people in your IT teams, almost have a book club or something. Get them to read it and then do some discussion around it. It's a quick read. For an IT professional, it's a fun read. For a non-IT person, it probably seems a little weird. But I try that as another way to sow the foundations and sow the cultural change.
It's absolutely a great book, and it will help with examples and what seemingly are real life stories. The other thing is that ITIL adoption is particularly in governments with bureaucratic management organizations, and ITIL emerged as this great, a lot of it was centered on the change management process and how well that would reduce risk and protect things. It's almost counterintuitive, but if you're already seeing benefits that can be related to speed, I would say that those are the types of benefits that you want to try and highlight with stakeholders. Now, there's also additional publications out there. There's a book called Accelerate, which talks about how, even though it sounds counterintuitive, the more changes that you do, the less risk there is of huge change failures. It has all kinds of great statistics. It's not a fun read, but when you're working on trying to get greater shareholder buy-in, there's the Puppet reports and the Accelerate publication that talks about all of the benefits associated with this better value, sooner, safer, happier approach of DevOps. And that might be another one that I would recommend you take a look at.
Excellent. Well, thanks for those questions, folks. Those are great questions. And we always like an opportunity where a question poses kind of a roundtable discussion. I think those are often more valuable than one-way presentations. So maybe we could look at in the future putting together more of these kind of roundtable discussions if we start thinking and seeing these types of questions, because I think participants love to hear the roundtable view on topics, and it seems to get a lot more interest often. So we'll look at those going forward. So a couple of the things I think just to wrap up, because we did promise a 10 o'clock wrap up, is again, two different kind of sides to who's the spectators and folks watching this presentation. I would say those who are like Adriana, who are trying to initiate change and get people on board inside their organization. And then you have people who are trying to understand how important this is in the marketplace for their own jobs, for their own resume. And I think sometimes you're on both sides, and you can be. I would say if you look at those stats that are up on that screen, it's pretty obvious to me that whether you've got your ITIL certification or not, you understand that certification on your resume is important, at least to open doors. So I think as an individual, it's probably a good idea for a few $100s to look at that certification. If you're somebody that's looking at it more of an organizational level, a couple quick anecdotal stories I would tell you that of why what John is saying and Jim is saying is important is just start the momentum. But way back in the late 90s, when I introduced ITIL to John Towsley, and John had been an IT in management at IT at Nabisco. He'd run his own IT services company up until that point. So he's now 15 years into it. And ITIL was coming over from Europe via Pink Elephant at the time. And I kind of started presenting him with what maybe we should be looking at this ITIL thing. And he read through the overview of what ITIL is, and he looks at me with his business background from Richard Ivey School of Business and his IT experience of doing this. And he said, "You mean people aren't doing this?" And we thought it was funny, but the reality is then he became aware, and the more he became aware at just a foundational level, the more those things started being incorporated into not only our business, but something that we could offer customers. So my point is this, is by having a few people start to get certified, by talking about the certification, by even offering to have executives or management folks take the certification course for a few $100s, the foundation level course, I know for me it did the same thing. It really highlights some things that just seem obvious that the founders of DevOps have created in terms of what should be, but also the fact that it is critical in this environment that speed and quality and service all come together, but culture has to change, and culture is only going to change if you get momentum among a lot of people. So I would say seed the certification with as many people as you think would be interested, because it's amazing when you get a foundational knowledge and you start talking the same language, the momentum that happens over the water cooler, well, I guess now with our virtual workforce, in chat rooms online and in your meetings. So I do think it's an important step to get some people to start thinking about a few extra $100 in your training budget for people. And when you look at these stats that we're looking at on the screen here, it obviously is worthwhile. I mean, there is a massive following in this area now, and it's not going away, and it's going to be the certification of the future in IT. Anything else, Jim and John, that you want to add before we wrap up?
Well, I think that's great. And thanks everyone for sharing the links to those books. And good luck on your journeys. And obviously anything we can do to help, we'll try to do. As I said, our approach to this market is much like it was to ITIL. We're trying to get a certification out as inexpensively as possible so that people can broadly adopt and gain the benefits.